All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, as we mentioned, we are going to be covering the greatest failures of 2020 today, and tomorrow we're going to be doing our greatest successes of 2020. So let's start off with what I think the greatest failures that happened this year were. First and foremost to me is the depression choice. Now, what do I mean by that? Back in April, I actually did a radar here about this, which is that as we saw mass unemployment, 2 million people per week signing up for unemployment checks, as we saw mass business failure, 100,000 restaurants have closed in this country. That's 1/6 of the original restaurant stock of the United States. As we saw mass small business closure, as we saw so many of the cascading and titanic effects of a horrific economic depression, we have to understand that it was a choice. It was a widespread elite choice made here in Washington by the President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, the Secretary of the Treasury. Everybody with some stake, with actual power in D.C., abandoned average working Americans by kicking them into an inefficient unemployment system and not covering their payroll from the very beginning. That was the original sin. It was that CARES Act back in March. But more importantly, we did not correct for our original sin, as the behavior and the titanic effects of that began to be felt at home, in people's pocketbooks, in the fact that they are now owing some 12 million people $5,000 in back rent. Somebody has to make that up at some point. And we all know that it's not going to be made up on their end. They're going to go bankrupt. They're going to be eventually evicted from their homes. And their landlords will eventually get bailed out by Washington. All of this is a choice that was made here from the beginning, a deliberate choice. In many cases, they make it want to seem that, oh, well, we had to do it this way, because that's just how the system is. Every individual was acting rationally on their behalf, and that's the worst part. It exposes to us, whenever the system works on its own behalf, that the rest of us are totally and completely screwed. So when you look at Europe and you see that almost every other developed country on earth is able to institute some sort of payroll program, and the people there are sitting on 4% unemployment and are just waiting to get that nice vaccine so that they can go back to work, remember that what we did here was a deliberate choice. Now, the second thing is about China. Now, look, it's almost cliche at this point to point out the fact that China lied about this pandemic from the very beginning, costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives across the globe. Now, that does not excuse Western leaders for their failed response. But the more important thing is this. Donald Trump ascended to the presidency largely by being the first person on the elite stage in over 40 years to acknowledge the threat that China poses to our freedom, to our economic system, how our own elites have sold us out and our working Americans in order to benefit the Chinese Communist Party. And yet, what did he do about it whenever the time actually came? Some Pew Research polling came out this year showing that every developed nation on earth, across the globe, whether they're an authoritarian dictatorship, whether they're a Western democracy, has seen public attitudes around China plummet. There has never been a better time in history in order to retaliate against this regime economically and institute the long-term changes that we need to see in our economy for working Americans, and more importantly, to suss out and stop the consistent perversion of our economy, of our elite, of our entire global financial system by a regime which has their own aspirations in order to take it all over, but only really in order to secure their own power in China and over the Chinese people. Think about this in a microcosm. Donald Trump, the man who ascended to the presidency on the backs of this populist economic message talking about China, never instituted a Buy American order in his own White House. This is the person who had Made in America parades. But whenever it came to actually executing policy, that just didn't happen. Yes, the tariffs on China and the trade war is something that I will always support and always credit him for bringing that to bear. But ultimately, he did not seize the moment whenever it mattered, and they are going to get away with this, largely, because I do not trust that Biden's going to do anything. If you really want to see a concrete, small example of this, take TikTok. It's an app which is downloaded tens of millions of times and used every day by American teenagers. It's owned by a company which bows to the Chinese Communist Party. We are a country so foolish that we allow such things to exist. The Trump administration said that they were going to ban it. They almost did. And then, because of their bumbling incompetence, that app remains to this day. Nothing will happen to it. That just goes to show what a lot of their China policy amounted to. They talked a big game, but at the end of the day and on their way out, they didn't do very much about it. And that's a titanic and incredible failure. And the last one here is pandemic partisanship. We covered some Pew Research polling earlier, I think it was in Thanksgiving, when we saw that we have the most politically polarized attitude on coronavirus of any Western nation. Think about that. It's not even that our response was all that worse. Yes, on the margins and more, it was bad. But the entire Western world is getting absolutely crushed by coronavirus, I think largely because of what makes us good, which is freedom, but that also is something that can have its costs in times like this. However, no country on earth saw political polarization around lockdowns, around mask wearing, around school closures, around so much. We saw democratic cities literally close schools in order to own Trump. And then we saw many Republicans get COVID, in some cases die, not wear masks in order to own the liberal media. Nobody needed it to be that way. And to that person, I actually blame Trump, which is, yes, the Democrats and many more are fools. They did many different things that were counterintuitive and were bad for the economy, were bad for people, and undermined faith in science during the riots and so much more. But that does not excuse that at the very top, when you're the commander-in-chief, people look to you in order to set the tone. And from the beginning, a tone of unseriousness, of trying to downplay this pandemic and more, was set by this administration. It was pursued that way. It was basically tried to be wished away. That turned this into a partisan hellhole circus, which is not something that any of us deserved in a time of crisis. So those are my three.
Yeah.
And Crystal, that last one, I think, is frankly unforgivable. Something I've really been thinking about, read a lot of history and all that, is that we try to emphasize our successes in our minds. So we'll think about like leaders who came to bear at great times. But what we undercount is that we also had some terrible times where we did exactly this. You have the major victory of the Civil War, and then you have like the failure of Reconstruction.
Right.
You have like the great victories in the Revolutionary period, and then you have like around 1815 where the country just kind of sucked. And like we don't study those periods as much, and that's kind of what we're in right now. That's like we're in like the Hoover area, just waiting for somebody to come. Except in this case, there's no FDR. It's a guy named Joe Biden. And so what do you do? And really, that is what has been kind of exposed to me in all three of those different things, which is that you had leaders, and this is a bipartisan thing, over the last 20 years, really, in which they could have made a series of deliberate choices in several different directions, which could have avoided where we are today. Then it all culminates in a crisis. And what we're used to in our minds is being like, every time America's in crisis, we make the right decision. Nope. Actually, we've made the wrong decision many times. We just don't think about it. And I think that's where we are right now. And we really have to reflect on those failures if we ever want to have a success again.
It's so true. Look, this year was always going to be brutal. Just from the coronavirus
election,
in and of itself. It was always going to be brutal. But as you point out so accurately, the choices that were made along the way are what took this from a tough year to an absolute disaster on every level. I mean, that really is what it is.
Yeah, it's true.
From the politicization of mask wearing to the weird selective decisions made by the media about which gatherings were okay and actually you should have some like you should be going to those gatherings versus the way that we devolved in this incredibly tribal way into weird Thanksgiving shaming and all of this. But you're absolutely right. Where does that all mostly stem from?
I think it's Trump.
I think it does come from the top. The way that he, from the beginning, views everything like his strategy from the beginning has always been to polarize. Mm-hmm. And it can be an effective political strategy. I mean, that's part of the problem here is it can be a very effective political strategy because when you polarize people like that and make this clear divide within the population, that means your people are always going to be with you. And that's exactly what we see right now. So in some ways it has worked for him. Ultimately, it didn't work for him enough to get reelected, which as an incumbent president is an embarrassment. But it isn't the fact of coronavirus itself that made this year such hell. It's the fact that we have a broken set of elites who are corrupt, who are, in many ways acting with nefarious intent, who are more concerned with their own hold on power, with their own TV appearances and fame and celebrity. I mean, truly.
That is true.
Than any of the impacts on people. And then the other thing that made this so terrible is the fact that they're also completely disconnected from the lives of most Americans. So part of why there hasn't been any impetus to do any additional stimulus, and why there was an impetus from the beginning to have the programs that every other developed nation in the world had, is because they weren't living, like, it wasn't their friends and neighbors and people that they had any contact with that were really most economically impacted by this pandemic. And so that disconnect combined with the corruption has led to the horrible state of results that we have.
And, you know, I don't want to drop the China one either, because this is going to be important. You're going to see the impact of this failure we will feel now for many times. Look, the Obamas basically wrote a blank check to China. They're like, you can do whatever you want. You can take as much of this country as you want. I thought Trump was actually going to do something, and he blunted some of it whenever it came to the trade war. But during the pandemic, the Buy American order, ventilators, they were, they're like, oh, maybe we're going to piss off the Fortune 500 companies with these. This is what Jared Kushner and many of the people inside
That's why
the
they didn't want to
administration.
do the Defense Production Act.
They didn't want to do the Defense Production Act for the same reason. And if you were at any sort of competent administration, you look at Australia, which is just, if you think it's bad for us with China, like Australia, it's 10 times worse. Any sort of competent administration, this is the very basics of diplomacy. You do some sort of like Melbourne Declaration where all the secretaries of state fly to Melbourne and you bring the Japanese and the South Koreans who hate the Chinese too, and the Singaporeans and Malaysia and all of that, and you're like, we're going to band together and have an international pact which is going to push back against China. I mean, how hard is that to do? What did they do? Nothing. I mean, seriously. Like, yeah, they were gallivanting around the Middle East trying to get their peace deal and their fake Nobel Peace Prize and all that, and I'm sure the Middle East is a lot safer now. I don't want to discount the normalization of relations, but it was just bringing out what was secret out into the open, and we all know that. Real work facilitating more deals for Boeing and Lockheed. Congratulations, everybody. This is not a serious administration whenever it came to pushing back against China. And big business ran the table in many ways that, I will try to reveal here as they become to light. We covered the Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and all those people running cover and pressuring the regime on behalf of the Chinese government and then getting all these concessions for Fortune 500 companies. It's so disgusting to watch how it all played out. I don't think Joe Biden's going to do anything about it, and I think we are resigned now to great power competition for decades to come when something could have actually been avoided. And it's one of his greatest failures.
Crises can be used to remake a country in a way that ultimately ends up, once you get through that crisis, being positive. I mean, the obvious example is the New Deal out of the Great Depression, which set the basic safety net for this country and helped to build the middle class for decades. All of the crises that we've had from 9/11, and then that leads to Iraq War, Afghanistan War. I mean, just an absolute disaster. Like, we would literally have been better off as a country if we did nothing in response to 9/11. We'd be in a better place now. Financial collapse, same thing. Look, the response to that made everything worse. Bailing out the banks, letting homeowners collapse, like the response to that exacerbated the existing problems. And it's the same thing here with this pandemic. There was another world with a different set of leaders in which this was an opportunity to remake the country, to shift things in a direction that would be more equitable, more fair, where there was more social cohesion, where we were stronger as a nation, ready to move forward. That did not happen.
It certainly didn't.
Next on Rising, we're going to talk with our panel about Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's very revealing comments about stimulus checks and how they relate to the Georgia race. That is when Rising returns.